You want to know what grief looks like? It's not the crying at the funeral. It's not the flowers or the sympathy cards or the casseroles your neighbors bring over because they don't know what else to do. No. Grief is walking through your own house 3 days after you've buried the love of your life, and everything feels like it belongs to someone else. The walls, the furniture, even the air itself seems foreign, like you're trespassing in your own damn life. I was moving through our bedroom, touching his shirts that still hung in the closet, still carrying his scent, when I heard the front door slam shut downstairs. Not a knock. Not a gentle entry. A slam. Like someone who owned the place. And that's when I knew my real nightmare was just beginning. Her voice carried up those stairs like ice water in my veins. That woman. That cold, calculating witch who had smiled through gritted teeth at the funeral, who had played the grieving mother while shooting daggers at me with her eyes. She was in my house. In our house. Without permission, without warning, without a shred of human decency. Are you going to come down here, or do I have to drag you down myself? 23 years. 23 years I'd been married to her son, and not once had she spoken to me with anything resembling warmth. But David had always been there as a buffer, deflecting her poison, protecting me from the worst of her venom. Now he was gone, and I was naked against her hatred. I found her in our living room, standing like a general surveying conquered territory. She wasn't looking at the family photos on the mantel, wasn't acknowledging the sympathy flowers that filled every surface. She was looking at me like I was something that needed to be swept away. Sit down, she commanded, like I was a child. Like I was nothing. But I remained standing. Something in me, maybe it was the last echo of David's strength, refused to cower. What are you doing here, Margaret? We just buried your son. Can't you let me grieve in peace? The laugh that came out of her mouth wasn't human. It was sharp, brutal, designed to cut. Grieve? Oh, honey, your grieving period is over. It's time to face reality. She reached into her purse, that expensive leather bag she always carried like a weapon, and pulled out a manila folder. The way she held it, like it contained my death sentence, made my stomach drop. You're finished here. Pack your things. Those words. Jesus Christ, those words. They didn't just hit me, they shattered me. Like someone had taken a sledgehammer to whatever was left of my world and reduced it to rubble. I actually felt my knees buckle, had to grab the back of our couch, David's couch, the one where he'd held me during his last days at home, just to stay upright. What are you talking about? She smiled then. Actually smiled. The kind of smile a snake might wear right before it strikes. Did you really think my son would leave everything to you? You, who contributed nothing to this family except being a convenient nursemaid when he got sick. Nursemaid. That's what she called 2 years of watching the man I loved waste away from cancer. 2 years of sleeping in hospital chairs, of learning medical terminology I never wanted to know, of holding his hand while poison dripped into his veins in the desperate hope it might save him. 2 years of being strong when he couldn't be, of hiding my terror so he wouldn't see it, of promising him every single day that I'd be okay, that he shouldn't worry about me, that love was enough to get us through anything. Nursemaid. Like I was hired help. Like I hadn't been by his side for over 2 decades, through job losses and deaths in the family and dreams deferred and small victories celebrated. Like I hadn't been the one holding his head when the chemo made him sick, researching every treatment option, advocating with doctors who wanted to give up, refusing to let him give up. But that's who I was to her. I was never David's wife. I was never part of the family. I was an interloper who had stolen her precious boy away from her, and now that he was gone, she could finally reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. These documents prove it, she continued, sliding the folder across our coffee table like she was serving divorce papers. You have no legal claim to any of this. Not the house, not the accounts, not a single stick of furniture. David may have been foolish enough to trust you with his final days, but he wasn't stupid enough to leave his inheritance to someone who brought nothing to this marriage but expectations. I stared at that folder like it might explode. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't even pick it up. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. David and I had talked about this. Not in detail, because who wants to plan for death when you're fighting for life, but we'd talked about it. He'd assured me I'd be taken care of. He'd promised me I wouldn't have to worry about anything except learning how to live without him. You're lying. My voice came out as a whisper, but it carried every ounce of desperation I felt. David wouldn't. He would never. Wouldn't he? She leaned forward, and I could smell her perfume, that heavy, suffocating scent she'd worn to every family gathering, every holiday, every occasion where she'd made sure I felt like an outsider. You think because you played house with him for a few years that you became family? You think because you held his hand while he was dying that you earned some kind of reward? The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. It was like she'd been saving up decades of resentment, storing it in some dark corner of her soul, and now she was finally free to unleash all of it on me. And I was too broken, too exhausted from grief and shock to fight back. I'm giving you 1 week, she announced, standing up and smoothing down her skirt like she'd just concluded a business meeting. 1 week to gather your personal belongings and find somewhere else to live. And by personal belongings, I mean your clothes and whatever trinkets you brought into this marriage. Everything else stays here, where it belongs. She moved toward the front door, then paused and turned back to me. The look on her face wasn't triumphant. It was worse than that. It was satisfied. Like she'd been waiting her entire adult life for this moment, for the chance to put me exactly where she thought I belonged. Oh, and don't even think about fighting this. I've already spoken to my lawyers. You'll lose, and you'll end up with even less than I'm offering you now. Take the week. Take it as a gift from David's family, the only gift you'll ever receive from us. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in that house full of flowers and memories and the echo of my own ragged breathing. I don't remember falling to the floor. I don't remember screaming until my throat was raw. I don't remember throwing my wedding photo across the room, watching the glass shatter against the wall where David and I had hung our first Christmas stockings as a married couple. But I must have done all of these things, because when I finally came back to myself hours later, I was lying in a pile of broken glass and wilted petals, and the sun had set outside our bedroom window. Our bedroom. Except it wasn't ours anymore, was it? According to Margaret's documents, it had never been ours. I was just a squatter who'd overstayed her welcome. The next few days passed in a haze of disbelief and panic. I kept expecting David to walk through that front door, to wrap his arms around me and tell me it was all a horrible mistake, that his mother had finally lost her mind completely, and we'd figure out how to handle it together. But David was in the ground, and I was alone with a deadline and nowhere to go. I tried calling David's cousin Robert, the one family member who'd always been kind to me. But when I reached him, his voice was strange, distant. He'd already heard from Margaret. She'd told him some story about David's final wishes, about how I was being difficult about accepting the terms of the will. Robert offered his condolences again and suggested I speak with a lawyer if I had concerns, but I could hear it in his voice. He believed her. They all believed her. I was the outsider, the one who didn't belong, and now that David wasn't there to vouch for me, I was nothing. I started packing because I didn't know what else to do. Every item I put into boxes felt like I was erasing pieces of our life together. The coffee mugs we'd bought on our anniversary trip to Vermont. The books we'd read aloud to each other during his treatment. The stupid little salt and pepper shakers shaped like penguins that David had insisted on buying because they made me laugh. Margaret showed up twice during that week, letting herself in with keys I didn't know she had. checking on my progress like a landlord inspecting a property. She walked through my house, touching things, mentally cataloging what she'd claim first. She even went through our bedroom, opening David's dresser drawers, rifling through his personal belongings like she was shopping at a yard sale. This watch was his father's, she announced during her second visit, holding up the timepiece David had worn every day since I'd known him. It should come back to the family. I wanted to scream that I was his family. That the family was us, was what we'd built together, was the life we'd shared and the promises we'd made and the love that had sustained us through everything. But I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. The grief had hollowed me out, and Margaret's cruelty was filling the empty spaces with poison. By the end of the week, I'd found a studio apartment above a diner 3 towns over. It was all I could afford with my savings. Savings that were pitifully small because we'd spent everything on David's treatment, on experimental therapies and second opinions, and hope that had ultimately meant nothing. The apartment was smaller than our guest bathroom had been. It smelled like grease from the restaurant below. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every conversation from the neighboring units. But it was mine. Or at least, it was mine for as long as I could make the rent payments. Moving day was agony. I'd hired the cheapest movers I could find, 2 college kids with a rusted truck who clearly had no experience with heartbreak. They treated my life like cargo, loading boxes without asking what was inside, what memories they were hauling away from the only home I'd known as an adult. Margaret was there, of course, supervising, making sure I didn't try to steal anything that belonged to her precious family legacy. She watched me load my car with the clothes David had bought me, with the jewelry he'd given me for birthdays and anniversaries, with the photo albums documenting our life together. And her face. God, her face. She looked like she was watching justice being served. As I took one last walk through our house, I stopped in the kitchenware. David had cooked for me when I was too tired to eat, where we'd had coffee every morning and planned our days, where he'd held me the night before his final hospital admission and promised me that everything would be okay. "Don't be so dramatic," Margaret called from the living room. "It's just a house. Houses don't love you back." But she was wrong. That house had loved me back. Every creaky floorboard, every paint chip, every corner where David and I had carved out our happiness. It had all loved me back. And now I was losing it, not because David hadn't cared enough to protect me, but because I was too grief-stricken and too naive to fight for what was mine. The studio apartment felt like a prison cell. I'd gone from a 4-bedroom house with a garden and a library and space to breathe to a single room where my bed, my kitchen, and my living area were all within arm's reach of each other. The windows faced a brick wall. There was no natural light. It was like living in a grave. For weeks, I barely left that room except to go to work. I'd taken a job at a nonprofit organization helping families navigate insurance claims. Ironic, considering I'd just been navigated right out of my own life. The work was mind-numbing, but it paid enough to cover rent and groceries, and it kept me busy enough that I couldn't spend every waking moment thinking about David or that house or the life that had been stolen from me. Margaret sent me texts. Actual texts. Like she was a teenager taunting someone on social media instead of a 67-year-old woman who'd just destroyed her dead son's widow. "Hope you're settling in well in your new place. Don't contact anyone from David's family again. Found some more of your things while cleaning out the house. We'll donate them rather than bother you. David would be so disappointed if he knew how difficult you made this transition." That last one nearly killed me. The idea that David would be disappointed in me, that somehow I was the one who'd failed in this situation, was so twisted and cruel that I almost threw my phone against the wall. But I didn't, because it was all I had left that connected me to the world outside that suffocating little room. 2 months after I'd moved out, I got a voicemail from someone claiming to be David's lawyer. I'd never heard the name before, Marcus Webb. And I assumed it was just another person trying to confirm that I'd given up any claim to David's estate. The message was brief. Mrs. Coleman, this is Marcus Webb from Webb and Associates. I need to speak with you urgently regarding your late husband's will. Please call me back as soon as possible. I ignored it. What was the point? I'd already lost everything. Whatever legal formality needed to be completed, whatever document needed to be signed to make my exile official, could wait. I wasn't ready to relive the humiliation, to have another lawyer explain to me in careful, professional language that I was entitled to nothing. But Marcus Webb was persistent. He called again the next day, and the day after that. Finally, he sent a certified letter to my apartment, which forced me to acknowledge that this wasn't going away. The letter was simple. Mrs. Coleman, I am the attorney who handled your husband's estate planning. We need to meet immediately. There are urgent matters regarding your late husband's will that require your attention. Please contact my office within 24 hours. I stared at that letter for an hour, trying to decode what it meant. Estate planning? David had never mentioned an attorney named Marcus Webb. All our legal documents, our house deed, our insurance policies, our simple wills, had been handled by a different firm, one that Margaret had apparently been in contact with. Finally, I called. Because even though I was terrified of what I might learn, even though I expected to hear confirmation of my worst fears, I needed to know. I needed to understand exactly how thoroughly David had abandoned me, so I could stop hoping for some miracle that would never come. The receptionist put me through immediately, like she'd been waiting for my call. Mrs. Coleman? The voice was warm, urgent, almost relieved. Thank God you finally called. I've been trying to reach you for months. I got your message, but I don't understand. I've never heard of you. David's legal matters were handled by... No, he interrupted, and there was something in his tone that made me sit up straighter. Whatever you think you know about your husband's legal arrangements, you need to set it aside. Do not move from where you are. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. I'm coming to you right now. The line went dead, and I was left staring at my phone, my heart pounding with something I was afraid to name. It felt too much like hope, and hope was dangerous. Hope could destroy what little stability I'd managed to build in this new, diminished life. Marcus Webb knocked on my door exactly 93 minutes later. I know because I'd been watching the clock, counting down minutes like they might explode. When I opened the door, I found a man in his 50s with kind eyes and an expression of barely controlled urgency. He was carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent. Mrs. Coleman, I'm Marcus Webb. We need to talk. I let him into my tiny apartment, watching him take in the cramped space, the moving boxes I still hadn't unpacked, the general atmosphere of defeat that permeated everything. He didn't comment on any of it, but I saw something flicker across his face. Anger, maybe, or disgust. Before we begin, he said, settling onto my salvaged couch like he was preparing for surgery, I need you to tell me exactly what happened after David's funeral. Every detail. Every conversation. Every document you were shown. So I told him. I told him about Margaret's ambush, about the documents she'd claimed proved I had no rights to David's estate, about the weak deadline and the humiliating eviction from my own home. I told him about the texts, about the isolation, about how David's entire family had disappeared from my life like I'd been erased from their history. With every word I spoke, Marcus's expression grew darker. By the time I finished, his hands were clenched into fists on his knees. Mrs. Coleman, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury, you have been the victim of fraud. Criminal fraud. The room seemed to tilt around me. What? He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, much thicker than the one Margaret had shown me. Your husband hired me 18 months before his death, shortly after his cancer diagnosis. He was very specific about what he wanted and why. Marcus spread documents across my coffee table. The same coffee table where Margaret had destroyed my world with her lies. David knew his mother well. He'd watched her manipulate and control people his entire life, and he was terrified of what she might try to do to you after he was gone. So he planned. Carefully. Meticulously. He pulled out a document that looked nothing like the papers Margaret had shown me. This one was thick, official, covered in legal stamps and notarizations. This is your husband's actual will, Mrs. Coleman. The one that was properly filed with the court. The one that leaves his entire estate to you. I couldn't breathe. The words were swimming on the page in front of me, but I could see my name. Over and over again, I could see my name. Margaret. The documents she showed me were drafts. Early versions that David had asked me to prepare while he was still deciding how to structure things. Somehow, she got access to them, probably through David's computer or email. But they were never finalized. They have no legal weight whatsoever. The rage that hit me then was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was pure, white-hot fury that made my vision go red around the edges. She'd known. That evil, manipulative witch had known she was lying to me. She'd known those documents were worthless, but she'd used them anyway to terrorize me in my moment of greatest vulnerability. How much? I asked through gritted teeth. How much did David leave me? Marcus smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Everything, Mrs. Coleman. The house, the bank accounts, the investment portfolio, the life insurance policy. You are the sole beneficiary of an estate worth approximately $2.3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. David and I had lived modestly, not poor, but carefully. We'd never talked about money in terms of millions. We'd never acted like people who had that kind of security. But apparently, David had been planning for my future with the same quiet determination he'd brought to everything else in our life. There's more, Marcus continued, pulling out another stack of papers. David recorded several video statements explaining his decisions. He wanted to make sure that if anyone challenged his wishes, his reasoning would be crystal clear. He also documented your mother-in-law's history of interference in your marriage, her attempts to undermine your relationship, her threats to contest any will that favored you. I was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication, of relief, of fury at what I'd been put through unnecessarily. She said David would be disappointed in me. She said I was being difficult. David left specific instructions about his mother, Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. She is to receive exactly one item from his estate, his grandmother's pearl necklace, which has been in the family for generations. Nothing else. And he included a letter explaining why. He handed me an envelope with my name written in David's familiar handwriting. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely open it. My dearest Sarah, it began, and just seeing his words, his thoughts, his voice speaking to me from beyond the grave, nearly shattered me completely. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I hope with all my heart that the transition has been easier for you than we both feared. But knowing my mother as I do, I suspect it has not been easy at all. I suspect she has tried to convince you that I loved you less than I did, that I trusted you less than I did, that I planned for your future less carefully than I did. She is wrong about all of it. You are my heart, Sarah. You are my partner, my best friend, my greatest love, and the person I trust most in this world. Every decision I have made about our future has been made with the absolute certainty that you will honor my wishes and use what I'm leaving you in ways that would make me proud. My mother will hate this. She has always believed that love is a finite resource, that by loving you completely, I somehow loved her less. She cannot understand that the heart expands, it doesn't divide. She cannot understand that you didn't steal me from her, you made me better, stronger, more capable of love than I ever was before. I know she will try to hurt you. I know she will use your grief and your kindness against you. Do not let her. You deserve everything I am giving you. You earned it through 2 decades of partnership, through your strength during my illness, through your promise to build a good life after I'm gone. Be fierce, my love. Be fierce in protecting what we built together." By the time I finished reading, I was sobbing so hard I couldn't see the page. Marcus waited patiently, not trying to comfort me or rush me, just letting me feel the full weight of David's love and protection reaching across death itself to shield me. "When can we go get my house back?" I finally asked. Marcus checked his watch. "Right now, if you're ready." We drove to the house in Marcus's BMW, and with every mile that passed, I felt stronger. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it was no longer mixed with the poison of abandonment and betrayal. David had loved me. David had protected me. And I was about to reclaim what had always been mine. Margaret's car was in the driveway. Our driveway. My driveway. She'd moved in completely, I realized. She was living in our house like she'd been born there, like she belonged there, like she hadn't committed fraud to get there. The front door was locked, but Marcus had brought a locksmith. "Legally, you have every right to enter," he explained as the locksmith worked. "This is your property. She is trespassing." When the door swung open, I could smell her perfume throughout the house. She'd changed things. Moved furniture, replaced our family photos with pictures of David as a child, pictures that erased me from his history. She'd turned our bedroom into her bedroom, our kitchen into her kitchen. She'd colonized our life. We found her in the living room, sitting in David's chair, the leather recliner where he'd spent his last months at home, where I'd curled up next to him during his final weeks. She was reading a magazine like she owned the place, like she belonged there, like this was justice. When she saw me walk in followed by Marcus, her face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they hadn't been so satisfying. Confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been fear. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, standing up and smoothing her skirt in that automatic gesture I'd seen 1,000 times. "I told you never to contact this family again." Marcus stepped forward, and suddenly he wasn't the kind, gentle man who'd comforted me in my apartment. He was a lawyer, sharp and dangerous and completely in control. "Margaret Coleman, I'm Marcus Webb, attorney for David Coleman's estate. You are currently unlawfully occupying property that belongs to my client, Sarah Coleman, the sole heir to her late husband's estate." I watched the color drain from Margaret's face as Marcus continued. "The documents you used to coerce Mrs. Coleman into leaving this house were fraudulent. They were draft documents with no legal validity. You have committed fraud, theft, and criminal trespass. You have approximately 10 minutes to gather your personal belongings before I call the police." "That's impossible," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice anymore. David would never. He wouldn't leave everything to her. "David left everything to his wife," Marcus said, emphasizing the word wife like a weapon. "As any reasonable husband would. He left you his grandmother's pearl necklace, which you'll find in the safe deposit box, along with a letter explaining why you received nothing else." Margaret looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in 23 years, I saw something other than contempt in her eyes. I saw fear. I saw the dawning realization that she'd overplayed her hand, that her cruelty had been witnessed and documented, that she was about to lose everything she thought she'd won. "You can't do this," she said, but her voice was breaking. "I'm his mother. I'm his family. I'm his widow," I replied, and my voice was steady now, strong in a way it hadn't been since David died. "I'm his next of kin. I'm his chosen family. And you're a guest in my house who has overstayed her welcome." I watched 23 years of arrogance collapse in an instant. Margaret had spent more than 2 decades treating me like an interloper, like someone who didn't belong, like someone who could be dismissed and diminished at will. She'd convinced herself that her connection to David was more valid than mine, more permanent, more legally protected. Now she knew the truth. Now she understood that David had seen her clearly, had understood exactly who she was and what she was capable of, and had chosen to protect me from her with the most powerful weapons at his disposal, money and the law. "I need time," she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded small. "I need time to figure out where to go." I could have thrown her out immediately. Marcus had made it clear that I had every legal right to do so. I could have called the police, had her arrested for fraud and theft, made her pay for every cruel word and manipulative game. I could have destroyed her the way she'd tried to destroy me. But I didn't. Because that's not who David had married, and it's not who he would have wanted me to become, even in victory. "You have 24 hours, I told her. 24 hours to pack your things and find somewhere else to go. After that, if you're still here, I'll have you arrested." She nodded, not looking at me, not acknowledging Marcus, just nodding like a child who'd been caught stealing candy. Then she walked upstairs to begin packing, and I heard her footsteps in our bedroom, my bedroom. For the last time. When she was gone, Marcus and I walked through the house together, cataloging what she'd changed, what she'd taken, what she'd destroyed in her brief reign as queen of my castle. She'd thrown away most of our photos, had boxed up anything that reminded her of my existence. But she hadn't been able to erase everything. The house still knew who it belonged to. The walls still held echoes of the laughter David and I had shared here. "What happens now?" I asked Marcus as we stood in the kitchen where David had made me breakfast every Sunday for 23 years. "Now you live," he said simply. "You live the life David wanted you to have. You use the resources he left you to build something beautiful. You honor his memory by being happy." That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in months. I expected it to be hard, expected to be overwhelmed by memories and grief and the echoes of David's absence. And there was some of that. There always would be. But mostly I felt protected. I felt loved. I felt like David's arms were still around me, keeping me safe, making sure I was okay. Margaret left the next morning. I watched from the kitchen window as she loaded her car with the same efficiency she'd used to load mine, the same cold precision that had characterized everything about her. She didn't knock on the door to say goodbye. She didn't leave a note or make any gesture toward reconciliation. She just drove away, and I never heard from her again. Not directly, anyway. Over the following weeks, as I worked with Marcus to understand the full scope of what David had left me, I learned about projects he'd been planning, investments he'd made, causes he'd wanted to support. He'd been building something larger than just our comfortable life together. He'd been building a legacy. There were plans for a foundation that would help families navigate the financial catastrophe of serious illness. There were investments in programs that provided emergency housing for people displaced by medical crises. There were trust funds set up to support research into the kind of cancer that had taken him, with the hope that other families might be spared what we'd endured. He started planning this 2 years ago, Marcus explained as we reviewed documents in what had been David's home office. Right after his diagnosis. He said he wanted his illness to mean something beyond just his own suffering. I understood then that David hadn't just left me money. He'd left me purpose. He'd left me a way to transform our pain into something healing, our loss into something that might prevent other losses. He'd trusted me not just to be comfortable, but to be worthy of his trust. The foundation became my full-time job. I left the nonprofit where I'd been hiding out and threw myself into building something that would have made David proud. We helped families apply for financial assistance when medical bills threatened to destroy them. We provided emergency grants for housing and childcare and transportation. We connected people with resources they didn't know existed. And slowly, we began to reach out to other widows who'd been blindsided by family disputes, who'd discovered in their moment of greatest vulnerability that they were more alone than they'd ever imagined. We provided legal assistance, emotional support, practical resources for rebuilding lives that had been shattered by death and then fractured by cruelty. It took almost 2 years, but eventually I got a call from Marcus. Margaret had reached out to him, asking if there might be volunteer opportunities with the foundation. She was living in a small apartment across town, working part-time at a department store, struggling to make ends meet on Social Security. She'd lost most of her friends during her brief period of imagined wealth, and she was lonely. She says she wants to make amends, Marcus told me. She says she understands now what David saw in you. I could have said no. I probably should have said no. But something in me, maybe it was David's influence, maybe it was my own need to close that circle of pain, made me curious about what redemption might look like for a woman who'd spent decades believing that love was a competition she was losing. I met her at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where neither of us held the power advantage. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, like losing the war had diminished her physically. When she saw me walk in, she stood up quickly, nervously, like she was afraid I might leave before we'd even spoken. "Sarah," she said, and my name in her mouth sounded different than it ever had before. Not hostile. Not dismissive. Just sad. We sat across from each other, two women who'd loved the same man in completely different ways, who'd been shaped by his loss in ways neither of us could have predicted. She ordered coffee with shaking hands and wouldn't meet my eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I know I nearly destroyed you when you were already destroyed. I know I used your grief against you like a weapon." I waited. There was more coming. I could feel it building in the space between us. "He wrote me a letter," she continued. "David. Part of the will. Marcus gave it to me after everything came out." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope that had been opened and refolded so many times it was soft as cloth. "He told me that he'd always known I was afraid of losing him, but that my fear had made me cruel to the person who made him happiest. He said he hoped that someday I'd understand that there was room in his heart for both of us, but that I'd spent so many years trying to make him choose that he'd had to choose. And he chose you. He chose love over fear." Tears were running down her face now, and I realized that this was the first time I'd ever seen Margaret cry. In all our years of family gatherings and holidays and strained conversations, she'd never shown vulnerability, never admitted weakness, never let anyone see her as anything other than perfectly controlled. "I destroyed everything because I was terrified of being forgotten," she whispered. "And now I have been forgotten. David's friends don't call me. His cousins don't visit. I'm alone with my fear, and it was all for nothing." I looked at this broken woman across the table from me and tried to reconcile her with the monster who'd invaded my house and terrorized me in my grief. They were the same person, but it was like seeing her from a completely different angle, understanding for the first time that her cruelty had been born from her own terror of abandonment. "The foundation needs volunteers," I heard myself saying. "People who understand loss. People who know what it's like to feel powerless." She looked up at me then, hope flickering in her eyes like a candle that might blow out at any moment. "I don't know if I can work with you," she said honestly. "I don't know if I can see you every day and not remember what I did, what I am. I don't know either," I admitted. "But maybe that's something we both need to learn. Maybe David left us both something to figure out." She started coming to the foundation once a week, helping with filing and data entry, tasks that kept her busy, but didn't require her to interact much with the families we served. I watched her learn our mission, understand what David had envisioned, see the impact that his planning was having on people who were going through the worst moments of their lives. Gradually, she began to understand what I'd meant to David, not as competition for his love, but as the partner who'd helped him become the kind of man who could imagine a foundation like this, who could think beyond his own pain to the pain of strangers, who could trust his widow to build something beautiful from their shared grief. And gradually, I began to understand what she'd meant to him too. Not the bitter, controlling woman I'd known, but the mother who'd raised him to be thoughtful and generous, who'd sacrificed for his education, who'd loved him fiercely even if she'd expressed that love in ways that were twisted by her own fears. We never became friends. We never became the family that David had probably hoped we might be. But we became something else. Two women who'd learned to carry their love for the same man without needing to diminish each other, who'd found a way to honor his memory by doing the work he'd dreamed of together. 3 years after that terrible day when she'd told me to pack my things, I was sitting in the foundation's office, reviewing grant applications, when Margaret knocked on my door. "There's a woman here," she said, her voice careful and professional. "Her husband died last week. Lung cancer. His family is claiming he changed his will before he died, that she has no right to their house. She's terrified." I looked up and saw something in Margaret's eyes that I'd never seen before: protective fury on behalf of someone else, righteous anger at cruelty being inflicted on the vulnerable. She'd become an advocate, a fierce defender of widows who were being victimized the way I'd been victimized. "I'll see her now," I said, and Margaret nodded, bringing in a woman who looked exactly the way I'd looked 3 years earlier, broken, terrified, convinced that the world had abandoned her completely. As I listened to her story, as I assured her that she wasn't alone, that we had resources and legal assistance and support systems, I thought about David. I thought about how he'd planned for this moment, how he'd trusted me to be here for this woman, how he'd known that our pain could be transformed into protection for others. That night, I went home to our house, my house, and walked through rooms that had been restored to the way David and I had arranged them. Our photos were back on the walls. Our books were back on the shelves. Everything that Margaret had tried to erase had been returned to its rightful place. But something had been added too. There was a new photo on the mantel, one I'd taken just a few weeks earlier of Margaret working with a group of volunteers, her face focused and determined as she helped a young widow understand her legal rights. It wasn't the face of the woman who'd destroyed my world 3 years earlier. It was the face of someone who'd learned to transform her own pain into protection for others. I stood in that living room, surrounded by memories and hope and the quiet satisfaction of work well done, and I felt David's presence in a way I hadn't since he died. Not as grief or loss, but as continuation. As proof that love doesn't end when the heart stops beating, that the best parts of who we are can outlive our bodies, can be carried forward by the people who understood what we were trying to build. He didn't leave me wealth, I realized as I looked around our home, now truly mine in ways it never was when he was alive. He left me power. The power to protect others the way he'd protected me. The power to transform pain into purpose. The power to prove that love always wins, even when it takes years for victory to become visible. Especially then.